So each piece of DLC has conveyed something in the first few minutes. Sunken Crown had a long, crooked hallway that projected the sense that you were traveling into a long-forgotten, ancient and crumbling kingdom. The Iron Crown DLC gave us wonder. That long walk along the chain imparted a sense of curiosity, just like it was meant to do in the story, because the story was about all these knights who came here to reclaim the replete stores of iron. Ivory Crown doesn't disappoint either. The cold, barren landscape, the biting wind, the oppressive view of this massive castle, the Ivory Crown, to me, screams, "Go back, you're not wanted here." And the visuals aren't the only thing telling you to go back, some voice is as well. Naturally, we press forward, because how hard could it be? Pretty bad, it turns out. You enter the first fog gate you see, and some voice starts rambling on about how you're going to die. It's really condescending. But what does she know? I'm the chosen undead, motherfucker. Oh, that's a giant invisible tiger? Yep, I'm dead. Yep. This dialogue and this death has a purpose though. It should make you mad, it should make you curious, because just before you died, you heard this woman talking about how you don't have a sign. And so finding this thing, this sign that can help you defeat this tiger, that becomes the focus of your irritation. It gives you an objective. It's one thing to give you an objective, but it's another thing to work that objective into the gameplay. The Souls games are good at this, and Dark Souls 2 does it here. This DLC does a good job of building intrigue. We see these white maidens kneeling, and you instinctively feel this sense of curiosity about them. Personally, I left them alone, but I know a lot of players are going to go through the first time and just attack them out of curiosity. Regardless of whether you're a kind player or a cruel one, both of you will learn to ignore the maidens, because ultimately they don't do anything, they don't drop anything, and as a result, they'll become as featureless and as unimportant as all the snow you trample upon. It's somewhere in the back of your mind. And the game wants this to happen to you. The game wants you to forget about these maidens, but more on that later. Speaking of enemies though, the biggest criticism I can find for this DLC, and all the other Lost Crown Trilogy DLCs, is how boring the standard enemies are. The first DLC's enemies are soldiers slightly taller than me and poison covered. The second are soldiers slightly taller than me, burnt and covered in iron. The third main soldier is, again, slightly taller than me and covered in ice, and you get the point. While I get that these technically suit the environment, they're a product of their environment, it does seem a bit uninspired when every enemy seems to be using a similar model, and it just feels like the same enemy in different skins. It's believable, don't get me wrong, it just got old quickly. Only the main enemies are boring in this way though, and there's plenty of other enemies that were actually interesting in some way. For example, From Software brings back Wheel Skeletons 2.0 in the form of these cute little rat dudes, and they also have these enemies that come to life if you kill another enemy near them, which forces you to use really good positioning and choose the location you have your fights in. They even made their Red Phantom AI even better. I mean, seriously, creativity in the way that they use Red Phantoms now, it's at a whole new high. We were all impressed in the first DLC when we saw Jester Thomas do a gesture, and in the second DLC we all cried out in frustration when we fought Maldron the Assassin, but these Phantoms in the third DLC, man, the moment that you meet the first Red Phantom is priceless, and there's a lot of funny things that these Phantoms will do that you just expect a human player to do, So while I might spoil a lot of things in this video, if there's anything I don't want to spoil, it's what that Red Phantom does to you. There's no way I'm spoiling that. Moving on to an analysis of how you move through the level, you'll remember in the Iron Crown DLC, you actually had to go past areas you'd already been to in order to access platforms that were moving, that weren't moving before. And in the Ivory Crown DLC, you also have to do this to an extent. You have to go through the level later on to see things you missed and to access previously inaccessible parts. The first time you go through, many paths and items are frozen or blocked by ice, so once it melts you have to remember the places where there was ice before so you can access it the second time through. Now, they handled this second run really well in some ways and badly in others. But ultimately I came away pretty disappointed with it. I mean, it's a way for them to pad out the experience. You're going through the same areas, you're fighting the same enemies, and because the main enemies are really boring and standard and I fought them a lot in the previous DLCs, I didn't really enjoy this experience. It rewards the player who took note of their surroundings, because those players are the ones that are going to remember which way to go. Which is good, I like that, I think that's a great thing to reward, but the problem I have with that is that my surroundings were so damn boring that I barely remembered them. Snowy outdoor area, empty brick indoor area, snowy outdoor area with a fountain, brick indoor area with a torch, you get the gist. This is okay aesthetically, I suppose. I mean, it is meant to be a really cold and barren landscape, but when a part of the gameplay actually requires you to remember these emotionless areas, and when a part of the gameplay actually requires you to go through these areas again, I think it's fairly unforgivable that the environments were really, really bland. You know, exploring more bland, emotionless rooms isn't very motivating, and going through it again felt a bit forced for me. You might feel differently, but I usually love snowy aesthetics. The painted world of Ariamis in Dark Souls 1 is actually my favorite area, but I think they did a poor job of making me care about the environments and the enemies here, and I think it could have been done better. Your second playthrough isn't all bad though. They introduce some really cool gameplay elements, because one of the highlights is fighting those ice maidens again. You remember how I said that those ice maidens faded into the background before? You know, they didn't do anything, so you either killed them or you either ignored them completely. Well, they punish you for ignoring them completely now. Ignoring them is something that will get you killed. Because now that the castle is warmer, I think those ice maidens must have thawed out or something, because now they will get up after you pass and, in true Dark Souls fashion, go up behind you and backstab you, just for forgetting about them. And you know, it is so easy to forget about them. They didn't have a purpose the first time you went through, and so you might find that they start to punish you if you keep forgetting about them. Their addition to the second playthrough of the level was a nice surprise, and I think it's a way to add a new enemy that was there all along. It's a great example of From Software playing you as a player. They're training you to expect one thing, only for them to change it on you later on, in the hopes that it gets you killed. Your expectation is your biggest weakness. For example, the Burnt Ivory King boss actually punishes you for being persistent the first time you fight him, whereas every other boss rewards persistence. The giant iron warriors in the Iron Crown DLC had spouts of flame that stop you circling around them and strafing and trying to attack them from the back. They forced you to fight them head on instead. Many DLC Black Phantoms also punish you for prioritizing their death when they're running away, and the enemies in the Sunken Crown DLC also had really high poise. All of these are examples of From gaining a lot from challenging your conventions. They're challenging your expectations, and as a result, experienced players might find their experience working against them, and that's a really good way of making the experienced player have trouble with something. Moving on to the bosses, which is my favorite part of the Ivory Crown DLC, just because they were presented in a really cool way. There seems to be a pattern when it comes to bosses in the DLC. There's always two great bosses and always one terrible boss. The same rings true in the Ivory Crown, except the two good bosses are incredible, and the third boss that is usually terrible it's not that bad. It's still bad, but it's not terrible. So the first good boss that you're going to encounter is the King's Pet, Ava. It's a tiger with a limited moveset, but it has really punishing attacks, so while you'll pick up on its attacks pretty quickly, you'll also get punished if you don't learn its attacks. You know, it's a really long fight as well, so it's one of those things where you have to be consistent and mistakes aren't tolerated. The best thing about it is the fact that it's not a humanoid enemy. I feel like in Dark Souls 2, way too many bosses consisted of humanoid designs, and I'm really happy to see another monster boss. Moving on to the final boss, I don't think anyone will disagree with me when I say that the final boss is easily the highlight of the DLC, if not the entire game. You've spent the last few hours freezing in a white wasteland, only to learn that the king ventured below his kingdom long ago to fight an ancient enemy, and he never returned. You go through a fog gate only to fall, and a dramatic color transition takes place which is timed perfectly with the music as you land on a small platform among the roiling lava, while the king's surviving knights fight alongside you with their corrupted brothers and against their lost king. And that's just the setup. The fight itself has a good flow to it, though I will say that it is a little bit too difficult on the first attempt, because you actually have to travel back through the entire DLC to find the king's old knights to help you with this fight. Your first attempt will likely be a death to teach you that you need to go back through the DLC, and just generally as a rule, I'm never a fan of when you need a mandatory death in order to learn something. I think it's a way for the gameplay to teach you something, but it's a little bit too harsh in my opinion. You need to go back through the DLC, and you need to find those 4 knights to fully realize just how good this fight can be. And once you do that, it's a great experience. The king looks a little bit generic, I suppose, and he has a really plain moveset, but the presentation is the highlight of this fight, and that fall down to the fight gave me the best holy shit moment in the entire game. I also think that the co-op area was one of the best ones so far. You guys know that I've complained about them in the previous DLCs, but this one actually uses gameplay to make you feel incredibly lost. As a result, you have an actual feeling of companionship and warmth that comes from having a partner as you brave the snowstorm together. This is the first DLC that actually made it so that you're not just fighting more enemies with your co-op partner, you're going through an area where having a partner means more than just being able to kill a lot of enemies together. You might actually do it for that feeling of companionship, or feeling less lost, or having an actual guide, you know? When you finally get to the boss fight, and I mean finally because it takes a hell of a long time to get to this boss, you'll realize that it's a double fight, which I generally dislike because I think that everything should be fair solo, and double boss fights just aren't. You know, they're always going to benefit from having a partner to fight them with just because you can split their attention. But if you accept that it's meant to be fought with someone else, or that it's a better fight with someone else, then it's a really good experience. It's 2 Avars, which makes sense because the king had multiple pets, but I think it also would have been better if the pets were different creatures. Fighting the same boss that you've already fought once, but there's 2 of them this time, is not a really good experience. It's not that creative, and since the blizzard that you have to go through before you get to the boss fight is one of the longest, hardest stretches in the entire game, most players will find themselves thinking, why am I fighting this again? I just walked for like 20 minutes to get to this boss and I've already fought it before? Is it really worth going through all that hardship just to fight this boss? Most of us don't play for the reward we get when we kill bosses. We play for the experience, and fighting 2 of the same boss isn't a particularly good one. That said, my first encounter was actually a lot of fun with them. I managed to get it first go, but I can imagine a lot of people who didn't get it first go would be really disillusioned with the fight. Because you fight the first one, and it takes a while to get him down to half health, and then the second one spawns. So as soon as you get the first one down to 50% health, 40% health, you have to finish him off really quick before the second one gets there. And there's a lot of RNG in actually being able to speed through that boss's health. You know, what if he dodges you a lot? Or something like that. I was lucky because I could damage him a lot and I got stuck underneath him and I could kill him real quick, but most people won't, and most people will end up fighting 2 of the same creature, which just makes the fight not good. It forces you to play defensively, and it's just not fun to fight 2 enemies like that. Enough negativity though. One thing that's great about all the boss experiences in the DLCs is the music. You might not notice the music while you're fighting for your life, but trust me, the OSTs they have for these fights are standouts above everything else in the rest of the game. In my opinion anyway. I might be exaggerating, but I reckon the music is so perfect for the bosses that I reckon you could guess which boss the music is for just by listening to the tone of the music. Seriously, check it out, I'll have a few links in the description. The story is another highlight. It's presented in a way that has homages to the previous game. It has implications for the rest of Dark Souls 2 as well, and it's also a story that can stand well on its own. I'll be going into detail later in a proper video, which I'm really looking forward to. It's a really good story. But one thing I don't understand is why they haven't introduced any new characters. This game was always lacking its Solaire. It didn't have an Ostrava. It didn't have a Siegmeier, you know? None of the characters were super standout, and I think they missed an opportunity to have a character going through the DLC with us, and also they missed an opportunity for a character to provide some much needed exposition, someone to explain what was going on in terms of the story. In terms of game design, characters are often the most difficult things to coordinate with the design of your game, because they involve working your story around the various lines of dialogue recorded by your voice actor, and that limits the amount of changes that can be made if you have a set voice already recorded, you know? What if the gameplay changes and that voice becomes obsolete? It can be difficult to work around. So I'll blame the lack of good characters in this DLC on time restraints. I have a feeling they would have done it if they could. I'm also going to be doing a separate video on the ending we get after we collect all the crowns. My short review of collecting all the crowns in every piece of DLC is that it raises as many questions as it answers, and unfortunately that leaves a lot of gaps in the lore that we were hoping would be explained, and that I am hoping will be answered in future DLCs, although I'm not holding my breath for any more DLC. In the end though, all 3 pieces of DLC are incredible value. If you enjoyed Dark Souls 2, you'll enjoy them. If you enjoyed Dark Souls 1, you'll especially enjoy them, because I think that every one of them offers something to a different player. I think they stand out significantly in terms of quality from the base game, but I'm curious, why do you think that is? Is it the level design that's complex and has shortcuts rather than straight paths? Is it the bosses that have a really unique element to each one of them? Maybe it was the overall presentation. Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to know what you think. There's also a poll you can vote in the description, and I encourage you to look at it to see what other people in the community think about the DLC. Results from the last poll show that most people rated the Iron Crown DLC a 9 or an 8 out of 10, and I'd really like to see how you think the Ivory Crown matches up, because community votes are really important too, it's not just my opinion. But other than that guys, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one, and I promise more good stuff is on the way. Bye bye.